containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.
Okay, let's dive right in. We are about to wade into what might be the single biggest literary detective story in the history of the Western world.
That is not an exaggeration, not at all.
I mean, we're talking about a puzzle that has kept scholars, theologians, and frankly, anyone interested in Western origins up at night for the better part of 3 centuries. It even has a name that sounds like a medical condition or something from a calculus textbook.
Right.
It's called the Synoptic Problem.
It does sound clinically dry, doesn't it? But you have to understand, this isn't just some dusty academic question. This is the foundational riddle of the New Testament. It's the Rosetta Stone, if I can use that metaphor, this early of Christian origins.
Right. And for anyone who hasn't, spent their life in a seminary library or digging through ancient Greek verb forms, the gist of it is this. You take the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called the Synoptic Gospels.
Synoptic just meaning to see together.
Yeah, exactly. And when you lay them out side by side, column by column, they are.
Yeah.
Well, they're suspiciously similar.
Suspicious is absolutely the right word. We aren't talking about 3 friends who all saw a car accident and later described it with, general similarities.
No.
We're talking about identical sentence structures, specific and often rare Greek phrasing, even the same parenthetical comments, appearing word for word in 2 or 3 of these texts.
It's like 3 students turning in term papers that are, 80% identical.
Yeah.
Someone copied. So the big question, the million-dollar question for scholars is, who copied whom?
Exactly. And for over 100 years, the standard academic answer, the one you'll hear in almost every university religion department from Oxford to Yale, is that they were all copying from a lost source, a hypothetical document.
Called Q.
Just the letter Q.
And Q stands for what, exactly?
It's short for Quell, which is just the German word for source, nothing more mysterious than that. The theory, which has really been the dominant consensus, is that there was this list of Jesus' sayings. No narrative, no miracles, just quotes, just the logia circulating around the early Christian communities.
So like a little booklet of the written wisdom of Jesus.
Pretty much. And the idea is that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark's gospel, but they also had a copy of this Q document, which they used to fill in all the teachings, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, that kind of thing.
But here's the catch, and this is where we usually get into the weeds of biblical scholarship. No one has ever found Q.
Ever. Not a single scrap of papyrus. Not one mention in an ancient library catalog. No church father ever says, as it is written in the Book of Q.
So it's a ghost.
It's a complete ghost document. It is a mathematical necessity to make the standard theory work, but physically it doesn't exist.
And this is where we can pivot to some really fascinating recent arguments, specifically looking at the work of a heavyweight scholar named MacDonald. We've seen him discuss this on forums like MythVision, and he's basically arguing that Q is dead. Or, as he put it much more politely, Q is going to hospice.
MacDonald is a brilliant scholar, and he represents a growing skepticism. His argument is, look, we don't need a ghost document to explain the Gospels. He thinks the Gospel writers weren't just copying a lost list of sayings. He thinks they were copying Homer.
Homer, as in the Odyssey and the Iliad.
The absolute bedrock of Greek education. MacDonald's theory, which he calls mimesis, is that these writers were essentially writing Greek fan fiction. They were taking the great hero of their culture, Odysseus, and creating a new Jewish and ultimately superior version in Jesus.
It's a fascinating argument. I mean, it's elegant and it solves the literary puzzle. But today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We aren't just going to look at Q versus Homer. We're going to pivot to the absolute elephant in the room.
Or, to be a bit more precise, the Sphinx in the room.
Precisely. Because while almost the entire Western Academy is looking north to Greece, to Homer, to Athens, or east to Judea, there is this massive, overwhelming body of evidence suggesting they are looking in completely the wrong direction. They should be looking south.
To Egypt.
And that is the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to critique that Eurocentric focus. specifically challenging Dennis MacDonald's reliance on Greek mimesis, using some incredibly heavy, controversial, and frankly mind-blowing sources. We've got Gerald Massey's 6-volume oeuvre, especially Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World.
A monumental work. We also have Walter Williams's The Historical Origin of Christianity, and crucially, the book that sort of reframes the whole academic enterprise, Martin Bernal's Black Athena.
And the thesis we're going to explore today is, to put it mildly, radical. It suggests that the Lost Gospel isn't a missing Greek document called Q. It's the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's the rituals of Horus and Iusa.
And the reason scholars like MacDonald are so obsessed with Homer instead of Horus isn't just about an honest mistake in reading the evidence. It's about a deep systemic bias, what Martin Bernal calls the Aryan model of history, that deliberately, and for political reasons, erased the African roots of Western civilization.
So the argument is that the missing link isn't missing at all.
Not at all. It's just been systematically ignored because it's Egyptian. It's carved in stone on the temple walls at Luxor. It's written on papyri that predate Christianity by thousands of years. But to see it, you have to be willing to take off the Greek glasses that Western academia has basically forced everyone to wear for the last 200 years.
All right, let's get into it.
Yeah.
To be fair, we need to set the stage properly with the status quo. What is this academic obsession with Q? And where does Dennis MacDonald's theory really fit into this landscape?
Well, to understand the obsession with Q, you have to understand the desire for history. If you're a biblical scholar or Christian theologian, your ultimate goal is almost always to get back to the historical Jesus.
The real guy. The man behind the myth.
The real guy. You want to peel back all the layers of church dogma, the miracles, the divine claims, the theology, and find the actual man who walked and talked in first century Galilee.
And Q is supposed to be the key to that.
Q is treated as the Holy Grail because, theoretically, it's the earliest, most primitive layer. If Q exists, it could get you back to the 50s AD, maybe even the 40s. It gets you tantalizingly close to the original voice of Jesus before the gospel writers like Mark or John turned him into a full-blown God figure.
But as we said, MacDonald is looking at this whole enterprise and saying, the emperor has no clothes.
He sees the fundamental cracks in the theory. He sees that Q is a circular argument. It's a document invented to solve a problem, and then its existence is proven by the problem it was invented to solve. So if Q never existed, then where did Matthew and Luke get all that extra material that's not in Mark?
And his answer is mimesis.
Mimesis, literary imitation. He argues that the gospel writers were highly educated men steeped in Greek literature. Homer was their Shakespeare, their Bible. They knew these stories by heart. So when they needed to construct a narrative for their hero, Jesus, they looked to the greatest hero they knew, Odysseus.
Can you give us a concrete example of that? How does that work in practice?
Oh, absolutely. Take the story of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. For MacDonald, this is a direct imitation of Odysseus battling the sea god Poseidon. The sea is a chaotic, demonic force in both stories, and the hero, through his divine connection, brings it to heel.
So Jesus is a new Odysseus.
A better Odysseus. The imitation is also a competition. The point is to show that Jesus can do what the Greek heroes did, but better. Odysseus visits the underworld to consult the dead. Jesus descends to Hades and conquers death itself. Odysseus is tied to the mast to resist the siren's song. Jesus is tied to the cross and saves all of humanity. MacDonald finds dozens of these structural parallels.
It makes a lot of sense on a literary level. It
Yeah.
definitely explains the narrative structure without needing a magical missing document.
But you're suggesting there's a huge bias baked right into this entire view.
It's a huge bias. It fundamentally assumes that the intellectual and cultural center of the world for these writers was Athens and Jerusalem, full stop. It assumes that the literary and philosophical DNA of what became Christianity is fundamentally Jewish and Greek.
The Greco-Roman lens. That's the perfect term for it. And what that lens does is it completely sidelines the cultural and intellectual juggernaut that was sitting right next door, a civilization that had dominated the region for 3,000 years, Egypt.
And we have to remember, Alexandria in Egypt was basically the New York City of the ancient world.
It was the intellectual capital of the planet. The great library was there. The most brilliant minds of the Hellenistic world were there. The Hebrew Bible itself was translated into Greek, the Septuagint in Egypt, for the Jewish community living in Egypt.
Right.
So to treat Egypt as just a backdrop or, a place the Holy Family visited once to escape Herod, it creates a massive indefensible blind spot.
And MacDonald's methodology, he relies heavily on Papias, right?
Yeah.
This early church father who supposedly gives us clues about how the Gospels were written.
He does. And this is a key point of contention. MacDonald, like many traditional scholars, tries to reconstruct Christian origins using Papias' testimony from the early 2nd century. Papias is the one who says things like Mark was the interpreter of Peter, or that Matthew compiled the sayings in a Hebrew style.
Oh, what's the problem with that?
The problem, and our sources, specifically Gerald Massey and Walter Williams, are crystal clear on this.
Yeah.
Relying on the church fathers is like asking the marketing department to give you the unvarnished history of the company. You're relying on the very people who created the cover-up.
They're the historicizers.
They're the historicizers. They're the ones whose entire project was to take a spiritual mythos and allegorical system and ground it in recent history to create a powerful political institution. If you trust Papias, you are trusting the PR department of the early Orthodox Church. You are trusting the fixers.
So that leads to the big question. Why is this blind spot so enormous? Why are brilliant, meticulous scholars like Dennis MacDonald looking at Homer and completely ignoring the Book of the Dead? This brings us to the geopolitical context and Martin Bernal's Black Athena.
This is absolutely crucial. You cannot understand the state of modern biblical scholarship without understanding Martin Bernal's work. He distinguishes between two fundamental models of history, what he calls the ancient model and the Aryan model.
Well, break those down for us, because the Aryan model sounds, well, it sounds exactly as sinister as it is, I imagine.
It has a very sinister origin. The ancient model is simple. It's what the ancient Greeks themselves believed. If you went back to 4th century BC Athens and asked Plato or Herodotus or Pythagoras, where did you get your gods? Where did you learn geometry? Where did you get your philosophy about the immortality of the soul? They wouldn't have said, oh, we brilliant Greeks invented it all from scratch.
What do they say?
They pointed south. They said, we went to Egypt. They openly and consistently viewed Egypt as the cradle of wisdom, the source of their most profound knowledge. They admitted they were students of the Egyptians. Herodotus is completely explicit that the names of nearly all the Greek gods came from Egypt.
So the ancients themselves knew they were borrowing heavily from Africa.
Without question, it was common knowledge. But then comes the 19th century. Bernal dates the shift from about 1785 to 1985. This is the era of European colonialism, of scientific racism, of the scramble for Africa, and the height of the transatlantic slave trade. The intellectual elite of Europe in Germany, England, France could not reconcile their intense admiration for classical Greece with the historical reality of Egypt.
They just couldn't accept that the pure, rational, democratic Greeks, who they saw as the direct ancestors of white European civilization, owed their entire culture to Black Africans.
Precisely. It was a cognitive dissonance they could not handle. It flew in the face of their entire worldview and their justification for empire. So they invented the Aryan model. They systematically whitewashed history. They argued that Greek genius must have developed in splendid isolation, or perhaps with some influence from hypothetical northern invaders, the fair-skinned Aryans.
They literally severed the link between the Nile and the Aegean.
They scrubbed the record. They created an intellectual embargo. And this had catastrophic consequences for biblical scholarship that we are still living with today. It created what you might call a disciplinary silo. You have Egyptologists over here reading hieroglyphs, often focused on archaeology and dynasties, and you have biblical scholars over there reading Greek and Hebrew, focused on theology and textual criticism.
And they don't talk to each other.
They do not talk to each other. So a scholar like Dennis MacDonald operates in an academic world where parallels automatically means Greek parallels. He sees Homeric echoes because he isn't trained or even encouraged to look for Egyptian ones. He is a product of this Aryan model, whether he knows it or not.
So he's finding the branch and calling it the root.
A perfect way to put it. But the root is much older and much further south. Bernal's core argument is that the Afroasiatic reality is undeniable. The archaeological and linguistic evidence is overwhelming that Greece itself was heavily influenced by Egypt and the Levant in the Bronze Age. So if that's true, then a Greek origin for the Gospels is actually just a filtered second-hand Egyptian origin.
Okay, let's get to that root. Let's talk about Gerald Massey. This guy wrote 6 massive volumes, an absolute mountain of research, but he's rarely, if ever, mentioned in standard divinity schools. What is his argument when it comes to Q?
Massey is the sledgehammer in this entire debate. He was a self-taught working-class scholar, a poet, a radical thinker in Victorian England who taught himself to read hieroglyphics. And because he was an outsider, he didn't have to play by the rules of the Aryan model.
He could see what the insiders were trained to ignore.
Exactly. And his argument regarding the synoptic problem is devastatingly simple. You do not need a hypothetical Q document if you have the Egyptian ritual, which we commonly call the Book of the Dead, and other related texts.
He talks about the logia, right? The sayings of Jesus that are supposed to make up Q.
Yes. In biblical studies, logia refers to the sayings of Jesus. Massey points out that in the Egyptian texts, you have the logia Kyriaka, the sayings of the Lord. But the Lord isn't a first-century Jewish rabbi. It's Horus, or more specifically, a form of Horus called Ayu-Imhotep.
Ayu-Imhotep. And that name means something like, he who comes in peace.
Right. Yes. He who comes with peace, or the Prince of Peace. And these sacred sayings were recorded by a scribe. Now, stick with me here, because this is where the linguistics get absolutely fascinating. Do you know the Egyptian title for a master scribe, the one who recorded sacred utterances?
I do not.
The title was Matthew, M-A-T-I-U. Massey argues that Matthew, the supposed author of the first gospel, the one most famous for its sayings, isn't a personal name, it's a title. The Matthew is the scribe of the god Thoth, who records the sayings of the Lord Horus.
Wait, hold on. So the gospel, according to Matthew, could literally mean the sacred writings as recorded by the scribe.
That is precisely Massey's argument. It completely changes the text from a biography written by an eyewitness named Matt to a ritual text, a collection of sacred sayings written down by a particular class of functionary.
That's a bombshell.
It is. And the content matches. You have the Oxyrhynchus papyri, these famous scraps found in Egypt containing sayings of Jesus that don't appear in the canonical Gospels. Massey argues these link directly back to the style and content of the sayings of Ayu-Imhotep, the Prince of Peace, who says things like, "Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That's an Egyptian formula.
And what about the style of speech? I'm thinking particularly of the Gospel of John with all the I am sayings. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life.
That has always been a puzzle for scholars. The Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels speaks in parables, short, pithy sayings. The Jesus of John speaks in these grand, mystical, first-person declarations. MacDonald might look for a Greek philosophical source for this, maybe from Stoicism.
But Massey says,
unroll the Egyptian papyri. Horus is constantly speaking in this exact format. It is his primary mode of speech. I am Horus in glory. I am the Lord of light. I am the heir of endless time. I am he that knoweth the paths of heaven. I am the plant that comes from the abyss of none. It goes on and on for pages.
So it's a template, a pre-existing literary and liturgical template.
It is the template. It was the liturgical formula used in Egyptian temple rituals for millennia before the Common Era. The initiate, in the process of becoming one with the god, would recite these lines. I am was the password to the divine. The writers of the Gospels didn't need Homer to invent a speech for a demigod. They had thousands of years of Egyptian liturgy where the deity speaks in the first person. I am.
Okay. General parallels are one thing. But for this to really hold water, we need to get into the specifics. This deep dive demands the details. So let's really test MacDonald's mimesis theory against the specific Egyptian evidence. Let's start with the virgin birth. MacDonald and the standard view see it as either a trope from Greek demigod myths or just a mistranslation of the word for young woman in the prophet Isaiah.
Right.
What does the Egyptian record say?
The Egyptian record says, go to the temple of Luxor. There's a temple there, built by Amenhotep III around 1700 BC, let that sink in, 17 centuries before the supposed birth of Christ.
Okay.
On the walls of the Holy of Holies, there is a sequence of 4 scenes carved in stone depicting the birth of the pharaoh, who is explicitly identified as the son of the god Amun-Ra.
And what are these 4 scenes?
First, you have the Annunciation. The god Thoth, the messenger, the divine word, the Logos figure, is shown announcing to the Virgin Queen, Mutamua, that she will bear a divine son.
The Annunciation, like the angel Gabriel and Mary.
The exact same function. Second, you have the Conception. The god Neph, representing the Holy Spirit, the breath of life, is shown with the queen. He holds the Ankh, the symbol of life, to her mouth and nostrils, and she conceives. It is an immaculate conception.
No physical act involved.
Absolutely none. It is a divine insemination through spirit. Third, you have the scene of the birth itself, with the queen on a building stool, attended by midwives and goddesses. And fourth, the scene of the adoration.
The adoration, you mean like the shepherds and the magi?
Precisely. The newborn divine child is shown enthroned, receiving gifts and adoration from 3 figures who are bringing offerings. This isn't a vague similarity. It is a 4-act play, a storyboard carved in stone. The Virgin Mother, Isis, or in this case Mudam-Ua, giving birth to the divine child, Horus, or Amenhotep as his incarnation, is the central myth of Egypt.
So when MacDonald looks for a Greek parallel for the birth of a demigod, he's ignoring a detailed scene-by-scene prequel that predates Homer himself by centuries.
And that's just the birth. Let's look at the ministry. Jesus famously has 12 disciples. Now, MacDonald might argue this mimics Odysseus's crew, or he might connect it to the 12 tribes of Israel.
Which is the standard explanation.
Right. But from an Egyptian perspective, you have to ask a more fundamental question. Jesus is called the light of the world. He is a solar figure, so who or what always follows the sun?
The hours.
The 12 hours of the day and the 12 hours of the night, the 12 signs of the zodiac through which the sun travels annually, the 12 judges in the hall of truth that the soul must face, the 12 eons or divine powers that emanate from the Godhead. The number 12 is fundamentally astronomical before it is historical. If you are writing a myth about the light of the world, you give him 12 companions because that is how the cosmos is structured. It's a symbolic necessity.
And then there's the big one, the ultimate miracle, the raising of the dead. I'm thinking of the story of Lazarus. This is one of my favorite parts of this research because the linguistic connection is it's breathtaking.
It is absolutely startling. So in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, Jesus goes to the village of Bethany to raise his friend Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and he has 2 sisters who are mourning him, Mary and Martha.
Right. A very famous story.
Now let's look at the Egyptian mystery drama, the central passion play of their entire religion. You have the dead god, Osiris. What is the Egyptian name for Osiris? It's Azar. And often, to denote his divinity, he was called Elisar, meaning the god Osiris.
Elisaris.
Lazarus.
There it is. The Isaias is just a common Latin or Greek suffix added to a name to make it masculine. Elisar becomes Lazarus, but it gets so much better. Who are the 2 chief divine mourners for the dead Osiris in the Egyptian texts?
His 2 sisters.
His 2 divine sisters, Isis and Nephthys.
Who are the counterparts to Mary and Martha? Identical roles. The 2 weeping sisters. And where does this all happen? In the Gospels, the location is the town of Bethany. In Egyptian, Bethanu, House of Anu, was a title for the great necropolis, the place of the dead and resurrection, a primary cult center of Osiris. So you have Elizar, Lazarus, being raised from the dead at Bethanu, Bethany, mourned by 2 sisters.
That is it's way too specific to be a coincidence.
Massey argues it's not a coincidence, it's a transcription. The writer of John's Gospel didn't record a historical event. He transposed an Egyptian mystery play into a Judean setting. He took the great myth of the raising of the Osiris, which is the allegorical promise of resurrection for every human soul, and he literalized it. He turned it into a one-time miracle performed by his hero Jesus on a specific man in a specific town.
And that, of course, leads us to the Passion, the crucifixion, the betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane.
And the parallels just keep coming with the same level of detail. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus watches by night in agony. His disciples fall asleep. He is betrayed by Judas with a kiss. In the Egyptian myth, Horus, in his role as the watchful sun, must watch by night for his father Ra as he travels through the underworld. The drowsy watchers who cannot stay awake are specifically mentioned in the Book of the Dead. And Horus is attacked by his dark brother, his enemy, Sut, also known as Set.
Sut. Is that where we get the name Satan?
The etymology is complex, but the conceptual role is identical. Sut is the adversary, the prince of darkness, the betrayer. And notice when the betrayal happens, Sut attacks Horus in the darkness and wounds him in the eye, the swords of light. Judas betrays Jesus in the dead of night. The function is the same, the betrayer of the light.
And the crucifixion itself. We're always taught to think of the cross as a uniquely Roman execution device.
And it was, for criminals. But as a religious symbol, it is vastly more ancient. The tat, or jed pillar, was the supreme symbol of Osiris. It was his backbone, representing stability, resurrection, and the linking of heaven and earth. It was a cross-like figure. And then there's the term that Massey uncovers, KRST. Yes. We find this term used in the Egyptian burial rites. The karast is the mummy, the anointed one. To karast a body was to embalm it, to anoint it with sacred oils and spices to prepare it for its future resurrection. The karast is the Christ, the anointed one.
So you're saying Christ might not just be a Greek translation of the Hebrew Messiah, but a direct linguistic lift from the Egyptian karast.
That is Massey's explosive argument. The karast is the type figure of the one who is buried but will rise again. Jesus is the Christ who dies and rises. The theological function and the etymological root are identical, and you can even take it to the detail of the two thieves crucified with him.
Right.
In some versions of the astronomical myth, Horus is the sun, crucified or fixed at the equinox, the great cross of the year. He is flanked by the two thieves, the forces of light and darkness, the past and the future, the two solstices that steal the daylight hours from each other. It is profound astronomical symbolism that has been literalized into a sordid historical execution.
This is a perfect bridge to our next section and the work of Walter Williams. He takes this massive pile of evidence, the parallels, the linguistics, and he doesn't pull any punches at all. He calls the entire thing a spoof.
Walter Williams is extremely direct. In his book, The Historical Origin of Christianity, his thesis is that what we call Christianity is, in his words, essentially an Egyptian rebrand. He sees it as a remix of ancient African spirituality that was deliberately repackaged by Europeans, specifically Greeks and Romans, for their own political and social purposes.
He also talks about the psychological impact of this. For him, it's not just about getting the history right, it's about reclaiming a stolen heritage.
Exactly. This is central to his work. Williams argues that for centuries, people of African descent have been taught, often forced, to worship a European god, a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus. But if the roots of that very religion are fundamentally African and Egyptian, then they are, in effect, worshiping their own ancestors' wisdom in a distorted, whitened form.
So he says they must hand back the religions of our oppressors.
Yes, because those religions are, in his view, stolen and deliberately misrepresented versions of their own ancestral traditions. It's a powerful and provocative decolonial argument.
Let's talk more about that whitened Jesus. Both Williams and Bernal touch on this. How did a concept rooted in Egyptian mythology, featuring Egyptian deities, become embodied in a European-looking man?
One of the most important historical figures for understanding this transition is a god named Serapis. This is absolutely crucial for the visualization of Christ. When the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty of rulers, took over Egypt after Alexander the Great, they had a problem. They needed a god that could unite their Greek subjects and their new Egyptian subjects.
A syncretic, committee-designed god.
Essentially, yes. The first Ptolemy, Ptolemy Soter, commissioned a new cult. They took the Egyptian god Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection, and fused him with the Apis bull, another sacred Egyptian symbol of fertility and strength. This created Osiris Apis, or Serapis.
But they didn't make him look Egyptian.
Not at all. That was the key. They gave the new god a completely Greek appearance. He was depicted as a bearded, majestic, philosophical-looking man, very much like the Greek gods Zeus or Hades. This visual transition is so important. Serapis became one of the most popular gods in the entire Roman Empire, and his image provided the visual template for the later artistic representations of the Christ figure. So before you even get to the debate about a historical Jesus, you have this popular Greco-Egyptian hybrid god paving the visual way.
That connects perfectly with Martin Bernal's Aryan model. The West wanted the wisdom, the logos, the Christ principle, but they could not accept the African face that originally came with it. So they had to create a new Greek origin story and a new Greek face.
Precisely. They severed the cord. They claimed the philosophy, the logos of John's Gospel, came from Greek Platonism, conveniently ignoring that Plato himself is said to have studied in Egypt. They claimed the narrative came from Jewish prophecy, or as Dennis MacDonald suggests, from Homeric epic. Anything and everything to avoid saying, we got this from the Nile.
Okay, so if this is true, if the gospel story is fundamentally a retelling of the Osirian drama, how on earth did we end up thinking it was history? How did we make the leap from the myth of Horus to the history of Jesus of Nazareth? This feels like the central methodological question.
This is what Gerald Massey calls the great fall into literalism. His term for it is carnalizing the Christ.
Carnalizing. I like that. Turning spirit into flesh, into carna.
Exactly. Massey, along with the ancient Gnostic writers, argues that the ancients, the Egyptians, the early initiates, understood these stories as profound allegory. They were, on one level, astronomical. The sun dying on the cross of the winter solstice and being reborn 3 days later. That wasn't a man dying on a hill, it was the sun. It was a description of nature.
And on a deeper level.
On a deeper level, it was spiritual psychology. It was the journey of the human soul. The soul descends and dies into the body, matter, the tomb of flesh, and must eventually resurrect into spiritual enlightenment or gnosis. The myth was the perennial truth about the human condition and our place in the cosmos.
But then came the carnalizers.
Yes. The historicizers, the early church fathers, men like Papias, Irenaeus, Eusebius, for a variety of political and social reasons, they took these sublime, multi-layered myths and said, no, no, this is not an allegory. This actually happened. A guy named Jesus, son of a carpenter, did all this in Jerusalem about 40 years ago.
They flattened the multidimensional myth into a one-dimensional and, frankly, unbelievable history.
They did. And in doing so, they created a timeline that doesn't work, which is why we have the Synoptic Problem in the first place. They had to stitch together collections of sayings, the logia, and episodes from the mythos, the Horus Osiris drama, and force them into a pseudo-historical narrative.
And that's why there are so many contradictions.
That's why the geography is often bizarre. That's why the trial scenes don't make any Roman legal sense. That's why the miracles break the laws of physics because they were never intended to be physical events in the first place. They also, for example, literalize the concept of the fallen heaven, which was originally an astronomical cycle, into a children's story about a talking snake and an apple.
And this is where Gnosticism fits into the picture. We're usually taught that Gnosticism was this weird, complicated heresy that popped up after Christianity was established and tried to make it all mystical and strange.
That is the orthodox narrative, written by the winners. But our sources today suggest the complete opposite. They argue that Gnosticism, or simply gnosis, knowledge, was the original Egyptian wisdom. It was the bridge. The Gnostics were the ones trying to preserve the original spiritual mythical meaning of the Christos.
So the Christians, the literalists, were the ones breaking away from the original tradition.
The Gnostics preserved the mythos. The Orthodox Christians created the false history. And because the literalists eventually won the political battle, thanks to the power of the Roman Empire under Constantine, they got to write the history books. They declared Gnosticism a heresy and burned their texts.
Until we found the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945.
And then, suddenly, we could read what the Gnostics themselves actually believed. And we find them saying things that are pure Egyptian philosophy, things that make no sense in a Judeo-Christian context, but perfect sense in an Egyptian one.
This completely reframes the entire Q debate, doesn't it?
It doesn't just reframe it, it obliterates it. Let's synthesize this whole thing. Dennis MacDonald is trying to solve a literary puzzle. Where did the text of the Gospels come from? He sees Greek words and Greek literary structures, so he looks for Greek books. He finds Homer. And look, maybe the scribes who wrote the Gospels did know Homer. That's plausible. But he is missing the deep structure, the mythological skeleton that lies beneath the Greek textual skin.
The deep dive counter is simple. You don't need Homer to explain the narrative structure. The entire life, death, and resurrection cycle was the Osirian drama acted out in Egyptian mystery plays for millennia.
That is the core of it. The Q fallacy is that scholars are desperately looking for a missing document to explain the sayings when the source material is carved in stone on the walls of Luxor. They're looking for a lost literary source for the narrative when the entire Passion Play was the central religious drama of the ancient world for 3,000 years.
And so the final verdict on Papias and the Church Fathers.
According to Massey, they were the obfuscators. Their job was to deliberately hide the Egyptian origins to create a new, distinct, and politically useful religion. So relying on them for the true story of Christian origins is like relying on the person who covered up the crime to help you solve it. They were building the silo, separating their new faith from its ancient African roots.
So we've effectively moved from the question, did Mark copy Homer, to the much bigger question, did the entire Western world copy Egypt?
That is the paradigm shift. And it changes everything. It changes how we view the history of Western civilization, not as a Greek miracle that sprang from nowhere, but as a direct child of African civilization. It changes how we view the Bible, not as a unique revelation dropped from the sky in Judea, but as a late retelling, a remix of ancient wisdom that was widespread across the entire Mediterranean basin.
And it fundamentally changes how we view the figure of Jesus.
It liberates him from the constraints of history. And this is the final provocation for you, the listener. If the Gospels are actually Egyptian wisdom disguised as Jewish history, what does that mean for the modern believer, or for that matter, the modern atheist?
It means we can stop arguing about whether a man really walked on water and start talking about what walking on water means. We stop arguing about history and start talking about meaning.
Exactly. The challenge here is a call to stop the endless, fruitless search for a historical Jesus who may or may not have walked in Galilee, and start trying to understand the mythical Christ within. The Christos that represents the human soul's eternal journey from darkness to light. This is a concept rooted deep in the African soil of ancient Egypt, long before the Aryan model tried to sever that root and claim the flower as its own.
And I think we have to end with that quote from Massey, or maybe it was Tom Harper who quoted him. Just sums up the whole point of why this matters so much.
Oh, I know the one you mean. The myth is the truth that happens always. History is the news that happens once.
That is something to chew on. Wow. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from the Q source to Homer to Horace. A huge thank you is owed to the sources Massey, Williams, Bernal. This has truly been a deep dive into the very roots of the myth.
Keep digging.
Always. Catch you next time.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.